Okay, I welcome everybody to the Rotary Club of New York, Club number 6, Host Club of America, so named by Paul Harris. Today is April 7, 2022, 12 noon right now. We start as always with the playing of the Star Spangled Banner by our pianist Audrey Levine. Thank you so much, Audrey. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you, everyone who is joining us here today. Particularly, I would like to recognize some of the large club executive directors who I've gotten to know over the years. Very pleased that you could join us today for a most exciting presentation. I pass now the word to our president, Judge Gerard Schriffen.
Thank you, Andreas. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Rotary Club of New York. I will mention this is being recorded. It's lunch hour here in New York City, and a lot of our members would love to be here personally with us, but duty calls, someone has to pay the rent. So we do have these recordings on YouTube, and we do know for a fact that they're very popular. We get feedback from a lot of our sister clubs around the world, so welcome. We're very honored today to have a very special guest. John Hewko is the General Secretary of Rotary International out of Evanston, Illinois. I'm very impressed with his background. As General Secretary, he heads a staff of Rotary International of over 800 at the world headquarters in Evanston, in Illinois. Prior to this, he was from 2004-2009 Vice President for Operations of Millennial Challenge Corporation, which was set up by the United States government in 2004, where he was in charge of delivering assistance to the world's poorest countries. We taught and was a negotiator for the United States program with over 26 countries delivering somewhere between $6 and $7 billion in foreign aid. Prior to that, he was an international partner of Baker McKenzie Law Firm Corporation dealing with emerging markets, where he helped set up the Moscow office. And he was also director and partner of at the office in Kyiv and in Prague, Czech Republic. He's a charter member of the first Rotary Club in Kyiv, public policy scholar, Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, adjunct professor at Georgetown, visiting scholar at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, has authored numerous papers and articles, has a law degree from Harvard, master's in modern history from Oxford University, a BA in government and Soviet studies from Hamilton College, and is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. I will also mention we had a personal friend of mine last year, Council of Foreign Relations, Sarwar Kashmiri, who authored a study on the China Belt and Road Initiative, which was very popular Zoom that we did. Welcome, sir. John Hewko, it's our honor to have you today as our guest. Welcome to the Rotary Club of New York.
Great. Thank you, President Gerard. Thank you so much for the invitation to be with the Rotary Club of New York, and thank you all for taking part in this meeting. What I'd like to do is perhaps divide my comments into two sections. One is just to share with you my personal thoughts. Again, not as the General Secretary of Rotary, not speaking on behalf of Rotary as an institution, but share with you my personal thoughts about some of the background of this war, why Putin invaded Ukraine, and sort of next steps forward for the international community. And then the second part, sort of summarize Rotary's response. And here in that second section, I will be speaking on behalf of Rotary as the General Secretary in terms of what we've done, what Rotarians around the world have been doing, and what we can continue to do in the future to help to support the efforts in Ukraine. So again, I just want to reiterate this. The first part of this presentation are my personal views, and don't necessarily reflect those of Rotary, and are being said in my personal capacity. So, obviously with the events that we're seeing unfolding in Ukraine are certainly unprecedented, certainly since the Second World War. The carnage, the devastation, the atrocities that are being committed against the Ukrainian populace in the Ukrainian country are shocking. We see it every day on the news. Most leaders, certainly in Europe, United States, have come out and characterized what's happening in Ukraine as war crimes, etc. So the question arises, why? What led to this? Why was all this carnage unleashed by Putin against Ukraine? And of course, I think there are sort of three reasons that you see discussed fairly widely in the press, and I'll quickly go through those. But I do think there's a fourth reason in my mind that is kind of a driver of his invasion. Again, I want to preface the fact that I did work in Moscow for 2 years, from 1989 to 1991. I did spend a considerably longer period of time, 5 years in Ukraine, and then 6 years in the Czech Republic. So and I'm a Ukrainian American. Both my parents were displaced persons from Ukraine after the Second World War. They were in the southern Germany in refugee camps for 5 years when the war ended. And then in 1949, we're fortunate enough to be able to come to the United States and settled in Detroit. And that's where I was born, and that's where I was from. But so I do have a natural bias toward Ukraine, given my own personal background, my family background. And I do have a considerable amount of family still in Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, mostly near the city of Ternopil. And so I'm sort of in daily contact with obviously family, friends, former colleagues, and just absolutely sort of heartbreaking as I sort of hear firsthand and follow firsthand what's happening. Very often when I'm speaking with my cousins, it's John, we got to get off the phone, or Ivana, we have to get off the phone. The air raid sirens have gone. It's 10 o'clock. We have to turn off the lights, and you can hear them in the background. And we always end by, well, I hope we're able to speak tomorrow. I've had close colleagues that I've worked with for years. One in particular has a 17-year-old son, and my colleague had foot surgery a week before the invasion, and he couldn't leave. So he and his wife stayed behind in Kyiv, and they put their 17-year-old son on a train and sent him off to Poland. He made it safely across the border, and then we had friends waiting there to take him to Krakow and place him with a family. So it's very personal to me. I say that up front, and it's obviously it will color my views. And I know Ukraine extraordinarily well. I know Russia less. So to the extent I'm making comments on Russian society, take those with a grain of salt. I did work there again a long time ago for 2 years. Still the Soviet Union. Less familiar with sort of contemporary situation in Russia. So all that is to really. Is the point of caveats. So I think there's three reasons that have sort of been highlighted. The first is as to why Putin did this, was this issue of NATO expansion. I think that's probably the least, in my view, compelling reason. In 1991, when Ukraine became independent, it had about 90,000 soldiers. By the time the Crimean invasion happened in 2014, it was down to something like 10,000. Zero military threat to Russia from Ukraine. Talk of Ukraine developing nuclear weapons is absolutely absurd. As we all know, in 1994, Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal. And under the Budapest memorandum that was signed at the time, Ukraine was given assurances. And again, people have been quibbling over assurances versus guarantees. But Ukraine was given assurances by Russia, the US, the UK, that their territorial integrity Ukraine's territorial integrity would be respected. Well, obviously that memorandum has been obviously violated grossly by Russia, but again, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. So I do think that NATO expansion was a part of Putin's calculus, but I think it played less of a role than the other three items that I'm going to be talking about. The second is this whole vision of restoring the Russian Empire and restoring the old Soviet Union. And here we don't have to guess what Putin is thinking, because he said so openly. He said so openly on numerous occasions that the fall of the Soviet Union was the worst tragedy that occurred in the 20th century. His article from July of 2021 this so-called historical argument, where he makes the case that the Ukrainians are not a people, it's not a language, it's a fiction created by Lenin and Stalin, and as a product of the revolution in 1917. It just says all you need to know. He doesn't consider Ukrainians as a legitimate people, as a legitimate state, and he says it openly and clearly in July of 2021 in his article. What's ironic, if you read it at the end, and I'm paraphrasing here, he ends it by saying, at the end of the day, Ukraine will be what its citizens decide it will be. And of course, we all know that in December of 1991, and I was very active in that whole process. During 1991, 1992, I was working as a legal advisor, took a leave of absence from the law firm I was working at and worked as a legal advisor in the Ukrainian parliament. I was in the parliament building during the days of the coup in August of 91. I was there when Ukraine declared independence. And I was very active in the movement by the democratic opposition to get a positive yes vote in the referendum in December of 1991. And every oblast, every region in Ukraine overwhelmingly voted for independence, even Crimea, by a small number, but majority of Crimeans voted for independence in 1991. So we have heard what the Ukrainian people have said. They voted for independence. They are an independent country. They have a separate language. They have a separate culture, and they have a separate identity. And we've seen that with this ferocious and heroic resistance that they've put up against a vastly superior and better armed army. So the second reason was this sort of restoration of the Soviet Empire, of the old Soviet Union, and this sort of feeling that that Ukraine is Russian, and is Russia, and it's his to take when he wants it. The third, and I think this is perhaps the most important of the three, is that if you look at Ukraine's development over the past 30 years, it's been a difficult development. Obviously, country continues and did even prior to the war have significant issues of corruption, rule of law, handful of oligarchs dominating the economy. But it was a fledgling, relatively strong democracy. I mean, they've had 6 presidential elections. Ukraine has a very vibrant and free press. That was an outcome of the Orange Revolution when Yushchenko became president. Very strong and thriving civil society. Other than the Baltics, perhaps no country in the former Soviet space had that level of strong civil society engagement. And we saw that in the Maidan revolution in 2014-15 as part of when they removed Yanukovych, and then of course that led to the Crimean invasion. So I think for Putin to have a country that's openly declared that it wants to join the West, that is moving toward the West, that was a relatively strong democracy with a thriving free press and a thriving civil society. In fact, think about it. This last president election when Zelensky won, you had a comedian. And by the way, his show is really funny. If you have a chance to watch it, it's on Netflix, very well dubbed if you don't speak Russian. You had a sitting incumbent president, Petro Poroshenko, with all the levers of power that the presidency grants one in these post-Soviet states. And he lost to a comedian, a political novice, by 75 points. Not 7, not 17, 75. And it's unheard of in well-established Western democracies. And I think that just shows you that, in terms of where Ukraine had come. So I think this factor of having a democratic state moving toward the West on his borders was something he couldn't stomach. The thought of a colored revolution happening in Russia, I think, was first and foremost on his mind. So those are the 3 reasons that you sort of hear discussed fairly widely in the press and in the commentaries. I think there's a 4th reason, and again, only proof of this, it's just my intuitive sense, is that with an independent Ukraine, Russia, in effect, has lost exclusive claim on perhaps 400 or 500 years of history. I went to college in the 70s, and when you took a course on the history of Russia, it began with Kievan Rus in the 900s, 800s, and it ended with modern times. And, Kievan Rus was based in Kiev, which today is the capital of a country called Ukraine, with an official state language called Ukrainian that is not Russian. And so historically, if you, at least in the West, when you're studying Russian history, that's Russian history. And the word Ukrainian appears in most history books, you know, in 1648 with Khmelnytsky's revolution and pogroms, and the World War I, more pogroms, and then World War II, you know, Nazi collaboration. And that's the extent, I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but that's the extent of sort of Ukrainian history that's embedded in that history of Russia textbook that one would use. Well, it's very difficult now for Russia to claim exclusive, you know, ownership of that period, particularly Kiev and Rus, when Kiev and Rus was centered in Kiev, which is the capital of an independent country called Ukraine. Sort of like the Americans claiming that Henry VIII was really an American historical figure because we happen to share a common imperial history at some point in the past. And so I think this loss of history is perhaps not out there, but I think subconsciously it's there, because without Ukraine, that historical claim becomes significantly more difficult. You know, at best for the Russians, they share it equally with the Ukrainians. But I think in this case, the tie goes to the people who are actually living there than those that when Kiev and Rus was a full-fledged powerhouse, Moscow was just was a swamp and forests. So I think those are, I would add that fourth reason to perhaps why this invasion took place. Second point I'd like to make is the sort of on the development of Ukraine as a country and as a people. In some ways, Putin is right in the sense that territorially, all the Ukrainian lands were gathered together thanks to, in some ways, Lenin and Stalin. As you know, Ukraine has been divided between Poland, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Russians, Austro-Hungarians. It's a country which is at the crossroads and has been sort of divvied up over the centuries by various powers. And here, ironically, Stalin, who led to the forced famine and starvation of 3 to 6 million Ukrainians in the Holodomor in the early 30s, is in some ways responsible for pulling Ukraine together territorially. And similarly, Putin has played a huge role in the creation of Ukrainians as a nation, a feeling of nationhood, which is extraordinarily ironic and quite interesting. If you look at the trajectory of Ukrainian development as a state from 1991 when it became independent, and I was right there at the beginning to where it is now, it's come an extraordinarily long way. In 91, when I was there, you did have significant differences between East and West, Russian-speaking Orthodox in the East, Ukrainian-speaking Catholic in the West. Western Ukraine had only been incorporated into the Soviet Union after the Second World War. Part of Poland and part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire before that. Completely different cultural and historical backgrounds, in some ways very distinct peoples, even though genetically they were all Ukrainians. And if this war had happened in 91, I mean, you would have not even remotely seen this sort of opposition and feeling of Ukrainian unity. And so over the years, that began to change. And where it really accelerated was really with the Orange Revolution. And then it continued to pick up speed with Maidan and Crimea. And so it was really, in some ways, Putin's actions. I mean, this is, at the end of the day, the Ukrainians created what they have, and they created their nation. But Putin did an enormous amount to accelerate that process. The more he denigrated Ukraine, the more he called it not a country, the more he called Ukrainian not a legitimate people and nation, the more he, in fact, was creating that feeling of nationhood among Ukrainians. And so once Crimea happened, and they were able to stop Putin's advance in Donbass, and get into this, this sort of stalemate war, the pace of Ukrainian nationhood and feeling this sense of patriotism as a nation accelerated tremendously. And now with this invasion, that's it. This was the final step. I mean, if you look at the cities that are fighting to the death against Russian aggression, they're all Russian-speaking cities. Sumy, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Mariupol. All these cities are predominantly Russian-speaking cities. And so what he has done, Putin, if his goal was to somehow embrace Ukraine, bring them back into the fold, fellow brother Slavs, it's absolutely the opposite. In fact, the saying now in Ukraine is, never forget, never forgive. And the level of hatred, rightfully so, that he has engendered with this brutal, absolutely unprecedented since the Second World War brutality, is to have severed Russian-Ukrainian relations, I think, for generations. Particularly among the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine, which has been so far the hardest hit because he hasn't gotten to central or Western Ukraine, which is predominantly Ukrainian speaking. So as we look at the development of Ukrainian history, it's somewhat ironic in a statehood that it was Stalin and Lenin who in some ways played a huge role in pulling together Ukrainians territorially. And Putin played a huge role in accelerating the process of nationhood through his actions, and now with this brutal and unprecedented war. Now, in terms of Rotary and what Rotary's response has been to this tragedy. And by the way, what we saw over the weekend in Bucha, the bodies, the executions, the horrors, is, in my view, it's just the tip of the iceberg. Once we see what's happened in Chernihiv, once we see what's happening in Mariupol. By the way, in Mariupol, there's stories now of Russians bringing in mobile crematoria to incinerate, to pick up all, they have learned a lesson in Bucha. You can't leave these bodies strewn on the streets for weeks because people will see them. And they're now starting to use these crematoria to destroy bodies, from what I understand, to sort of destroy the evidence. But you have a city like Mariupol, which has been complete, 450,000 people. It's like taking the city of Milwaukee or something and just leveling it to the ground. It's just extraordinary what is happening. But what's unfolded, of course, is an incredible tragedy. And so the question then is, how does Ukraine rebuild after this? How does Ukraine reconstruct? What role is Rotary going to play? So to date, and here I switch now and put on my hat as your General Secretary. I've been extraordinarily proud of the reaction of Ukrainians around the world. We established about 4 weeks ago a Ukrainian response fund. We now have almost $7.5 million that we have been able to gather from Rotarians around the world in this very short period of time. We have opened up the ability for districts around the world, particularly in Ukraine and the frontline countries, to apply for grants out of that fund. We have moved a little over $1 million to date from that fund, largely to districts in the region. And we have another 500,000 coming down the pike shortly. So, these funds are all being used for refugee-related activities: food, shelter, medicine, transportation, housing, etc. And the response, not only by the Ukrainian Rotarians, who, by the way, are in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Many of them have had to leave their homes. Many of them had their homes destroyed. Many of them are hiding out in Western Ukraine. Many of them had to send their children and families abroad. And by the way, if we look at the refugee situation, in 4 weeks or 5 weeks, 4.5 million people. I mean, that's unprecedented. It's not 4 months, not 4 years, 4.5 weeks, plus the 6 million internally displaced people in Ukraine. Plus, you already had well over 1 million internally displaced people from the Crimean War, starting in 2014. So just an unprecedented refugee crisis, unseen since the Second World War. And our Rotarians in the frontline countries have truly stepped up. We've established a landing page on our website where you can go and learn how to apply for a disaster response grant. You see stories of what Rotarians are doing, learn the mechanics of how to help Ukraine through the disaster response fund. They've set up hubs, Rotary hubs, in each of the frontline countries for depots, warehouses to receive medicines and other materials. And then right across the border from each of these is a similar warehouse and hub that the Rotarians in Ukraine are maintaining. And so the goods go into, let's say, to Ismail, to go into the hub in Romania, and then comes across the border into a warehouse in Ukraine. And then the Ukrainian Rotarians pick that equipment up, and medical equipment or supplies, and distribute it as needed in the areas. So Poland, of course, has just been extraordinary, accepting more than 2 million refugees, as have the other frontline countries. And of course, as the refugees move from the frontline countries into Germany, Italy, Spain, other countries that have significant Ukrainian populations already, then obviously the needs are going to be very great in those countries as well. So I think I'll conclude my remarks by simply saying our response has been exemplary. I'm extraordinarily proud to be a Rotarian and to be leading this organization. Again, $7.5 million raised in a very short period of time. Extraordinary support coming from Rotarians throughout Europe, particularly in the frontline countries. Extraordinary bravery and perseverance by our Ukrainian colleagues, our Ukrainian Rotarians, to do. They're meeting daily. They're continuing to do work in the face of this horrific atrocities and crimes against humanity that are being perpetrated by Putin and his army. Now, in terms of the United States, the U.S. districts are eligible to apply for these disaster response grants. They're intended to be used for Ukrainian refugee purposes in your respective district. We have made an exception. There were 10 US districts and 5 Argentine districts that pooled their grant money together to buy $400,000 worth of medical equipment in the States and ship it to the frontline countries and to Ukraine for use in helping the Ukrainian refugees. But the default is, you apply for the grant and you use it for refugee or displaced persons work, Ukrainian work in your district. The Biden administration has indicated they're going to accept 100,000 Ukrainian displaced persons or refugees, and we'll see how that all plays out. I think, as all of us are aware, our immigration system is very cumbersome, very complicated, hard to deal with. I was on a call yesterday with leaders of the Ukrainian American community and with Welcome USA, which is a entity that's been established to primarily deal with Afghan resettlement, but they're now also focusing on the Ukrainian issue, and still a lot of uncertainty about how this is all going to play out in the States. But we got 7.3 million, 7.5 to move, and we're going to probably, I would suspect, grow that to close to 10. I don't know what the final number will be by April 30th when we close the fund, but certainly a lot of funding available to do good and to help. So, President Jared, I'll stop there, perhaps, and be happy to take questions or comments that, or suggestions or thoughts that the club members may have. And again, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, John. It was really a privilege and a pleasure to have you with us today. And I must say, I do agree with your analysis as to the motivations for what Putin has done. I also have a master's degree in international affairs in Russian. And I remember the very first lesson we had was this centuries-old argument of, Kievan Rus and where it came from and who's going to take credit for it. And it's still with us, unfortunately. And also, you're correct, in my opinion, that Putin cannot allow to have a Ukraine that is a democracy right on the border with Russia. The comparison, the contrast is too great for someone like him to stomach. And again, history repeating itself. When Kosciuszko left the United States and went to Poland, and they had the uprising in 1794, he freed the serfs. Jews became citizens. The Constitution, Bill of Rights was put into the Polish Constitution. And of course, Catherine could not accept this. This was just too much. Catherine the Great couldn't accept this. I mean, the idea of, freeing the serfs, having a democracy right on the border with Tsarist Russia, it had to go. And so it's kind of like history repeating itself. Right. We have a number of Rotarians from around the world with us. I will say, my club became very active in making donations directly to Rotary clubs in Lviv, through Polish banks in Warsaw. I know one of our sister clubs, Wiesbaden, is with us today, Michael, and they've been very, very busy, active in sending caravans, literally sending caravans on a regular basis from Germany to the border with Ukraine. So Rotarians, we're very proud of what they have been doing. If no one has a question as of yet, I'm looking in the chat room. Let me ask you this question.
Jared, I do see a number of hands.
Okay,
up.
then let's just
I see 4 or 5 hands up. If you want to perhaps start with those folks.
Michael, I see your hand up. Let me start with you and then Richard. Michael, go ahead.
Thank you very much, John. An impressive talk. I appreciate that. I'm coming from a country with the worst track record in human history. And still, after the end of World War II, we are readmitted to civilization. And you're mentioning the growing hatred between Russians and Ukrainians, rightfully so probably. That really made me think, is there any chance at all to get back on some kind of human and civilized relationship? I'm talking to you from a place where 2 blocks from here, the US organized the Berlin Airlift. That was, what, 10 years after the end of World War II. I'm really wondering and hoping that we as Rotarians can play a role in creating peace, hopefully soon, and then that people become people again and don't live on hatred and shooting each other. What is your take on that?
Yeah, Michael, thank you. That's a great question. It's a complicated question, and I think it has a number of different facets too. By the way, I'm speaking in a half hour to the Dusseldorf Club, so I'll be moving to your side of the world very, very shortly. The beauty of Zoom and technology here. I think there's a number of different aspects to it. And again, I'm not an expert on post-war Germany, but I do suspect that after the war, there was a deep, profound rethinking by the German people of why did we do this? What led to this? And a significant internal analysis of we need to do things differently. And I think you saw a shift, and correct me if I'm wrong, in German mentality. And there was a real internal reckoning and a looking into the mirror and really an attempt. That is not, and I say this in my personal capacity again, not as as a Rotary official. I don't see that has happened since by the Russians after the fall of the Soviet Union. If anything, there's a lot of we were the real. I was from some of my Russian. We were the real victims of the Soviet Union. Yeah, really. Your language, your culture dominated. Everything was run out of Moscow. It wasn't run out of Tashkent. It wasn't run out of Yerevan. It wasn't run out of Tbilisi. It wasn't run out of Kyiv. It was run out of Moscow. So I don't think there has been a sort of internal looking in the mirror and saying, what do we need to do to change as a people? And I very much hope, Michael, that it seems to me that a part of the solution going forward to bridge this gap is, one, Putin needs to be eliminated. I can't see any reconciliation happening or anything happening as long as Putin and his authoritarian regime remain in power. That's a given. Now the question is, who's going to replace him? Another Silovik, more of these Siloviki? Who's on deck, so to speak, in Russian leadership? And again, I don't know enough about what's going on in Russia today politically to know who's on deck that could step in and begin that transformation within Russia. But a huge part of it's going to have to be a rethinking and a deep looking into the mirror by Russian society and asking themselves, how did we get to the point where we allowed a guy like Putin to come to power? 22 years of nonstop propaganda, well, not 22 years, but certainly let's say last 10, 15 years, nonstop propaganda and authoritarianism, where we launch an unprovoked war against a neighbor who is no threat to us, who we claim as our Slavic brother and sister. And then a country that allows our army to create these, atrocities not really seen on that kind of scale and scope since the Second World War. So I think that's an important element in this for the Russians to step back and do some thinking. And here I think Rotary, though, can play a huge role. If this all shakes out, there's regime change in Russia, Ukraine survives as a country, then I think what we have done historically is exactly part of what's going to be needed. What are we experts at? Bringing people together, that human personal contact, whether it's through our youth exchange programs, whether it's through RILA, whether it's through our global grants, whether it's through what was called GSE in the past, our fellow, we are extraordinarily good at bringing people together and holding dialogue on a people-to-people level. And that's what it's going to take, person by person, to rebuild those connections, to rebuild that trust and that human connectivity. But it can't start unless, in my view, you see, and Biden was right, regime change in Russia, Putin needs to go, and Ukraine needs to survive as a state, the war needs to end, and I think at that point the healing can begin. But it's going to be, Michael, as you can appreciate, very, very difficult, right? I mean, the destruction and death and barbarity that we're seeing, it's going to be very hard for Ukrainians to sort of forget about that and kind of casually move on. But it is possible, it has to happen, and I think Rotary can play a huge role given our experience in doing this in other contexts, in helping heal these wounds once all this comes to an end.
Thank you. Richard Denton, question. Unmute yourself, Richard. There you go.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John, for a marvelous talk here this morning. I'm just wondering what Rotary International can do in terms of mediation. Rotary has played a big role at the United Nations. We're a partner with Mediators Beyond Borders. I see on this call there's Ernest Thiessen, who's come up with a computer program for working out mediation. And so I'm just wondering what Rotary International can do maybe on a larger stage, such as at the UN. Also, in negotiating a ceasefire, Rotary International negotiated ceasefires in Sri Lanka for immunization for the polio plus. And I'm wondering again, if we could get a ceasefire to promote dialogue.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a great point. And for those on the call who may not be familiar with we've used historically polio eradication as a vehicle for setting the stage for peaceful solutions to occur. For example, in Sri Lanka and other countries, we would have these days of tranquility where both combatant sides would agree to step down for 24 hours, 48, 72 hours while we go in and vaccinate the children. And that ceasefire that resulted through the vaccination efforts then led to peace talks between the warring factions and the warring parties, and eventually led to peace settlements. Whether that can be replicated here, I don't know. The scale and scope is so large here, and almost the entire international community is involved. The number of governments, and this is on such a scale that I think something as straightforward as what we were able to do in, let's say, Sri Lanka, is kind of going to probably be fairly difficult to pull off here. I think ultimately the peace here is going to be determined by the battlefield results. And if Ukraine can push back Russia, certainly back to the pre-February 24th borders, that's going to be a very different peace negotiation than if Putin winds up taking all of Eastern, is able to create that land bridge and hold it from Crimea up to Donbass and winds up taking the rest of the Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast. So unfortunately, I think the military piece is going to determine in large part the shape and character of what the peace post-war situation will look like. But I think we have an enormous role to play now in terms of the humanitarian piece, helping the refugees, resettling the refugees, and continuing our person-to-person contacts and efforts. And then once this war is over, at that point, I think we pick up our head and say, okay, what more can we do based on the reality that's there on the ground? Obviously, if Putin is gone, a new regime in Russia, Rotary in Russia can openly operate freely, and we can really work hard at bringing these people-to-people contacts in place. If the war ends and Russia continues to be this police state that it is, where our Rotarians in Russia are frankly scared to death of even picking their heads up and saying anything, then of course that people-to-people person thing becomes impossible because of the danger that our counterparts in Russia face by participating in this process. So I think it's still too early to say, other than we do know immediately we've got this humanitarian need that we are filling that void and need to continue to do.
Thank you, John. There are a number of people have their hands up, and I'm afraid we may not be able to get to all of you in the time remaining. So please keep your comments or questions short. Barbara Muller.
Thank you. John, your speech was excellent. We needed that now as a Rotarian. I'm very proud of us. But what gives you hope? And how can we have these conversations that could end this tragedy?
Well, again, I think, as I said, right now, the reality is, given the situation in Russia, that the best thing we can do now is to support Ukraine morally, urging continued support for Ukraine's military efforts. And again, that kind of goes against our tendency to push for peace. But Ukraine needs to win this war if we're going to have some kind of a resolution here that, in my view, leads to a good outcome long term. and then really focus on the humanitarian piece. And as I said in the earlier answer, once this ends and we see what the landscape looks like, at that point, we can then put in place plans to start this people-to-people thing. Because again, right now, our Russian Rotarians are in a very difficult state. They're petrified. They know that they speak out against, or, they have not reached out at all to the Ukrainians. And I get that. There's been no contact with Ukrainian Rotary leadership from Russian leadership because they're afraid, right? They're afraid that if they do that, they're going to be in real trouble in Russia. So that's fundamental for me. There has to be a change in Russia that allows this person-to-person thing to happen. Right now, we've got an iron curtain, a new iron curtain in place. Until that's removed, it's practically impossible to do anything.
Well, your voice is really needed now, and I thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Dennis Wong.
Thank you. The longer the war goes on, the more lives are lost. And I wondered, how could Rotary join with other civil service organizations to put pressure on the member states to fulfill their commitment for peace and end the war?
Well, yeah, I mean, John, that's a great point. I mean, it takes two to tango, right? I mean, there's what Putin is doing and what the West and Ukraine are doing in response. So for me, the onus is on Putin. He started this war. He's continuing this war. If he were to withdraw, certainly at least to the pre-February 24th borders, I think the war would probably end. And so I think the ball is in Putin's court. And until if he's not willing to change or is not willing to go in this peaceful direction, I think we have no choice but to continue to support Ukraine, militarily in a humanitarian fashion, to allow themselves to defend themselves, and hopefully win this war, and then which will then hopefully lead to some sort of peace. But you're right. In the meantime, people are going to lose their lives, and that's on Putin. It's not on the Ukrainians, and it's not on the West. Ukrainians didn't start the war.
John, there's been a motion that was made in our club that we will consider, and I wanted your reaction to this. How would Rotary International react to a petition by Rotarians to put pressure on those corporations that refuse to stop doing business in Russia?
Yeah, I think, Rotary International, we need to be careful in that, and we will be coming out with a statement on the war. That strikes me as perhaps something I'd like to see happen. Of course, I support that. But I think if individual clubs want to go that and make those statements, by all means, clubs are free to take the positions they feel they need to take. Whether RI would take that position, I don't know. It's hard. I don't know. It's a complicated question because we are apolitical. But yeah, that's a hard one for me to answer, Gerard. I think certainly if a club wishes to do that, by all means, or a district, you're free to do so, in my view, at least.
Thank you. Tony.
Yes, thank you, Secretary Hewko. I want to just follow up on Richard's comments and also reflect on, we're talking a lot about what we can do in Rotary afterwards, but you just mentioned about Rotary is going to have a statement. And I really think it would be great, and you mentioned apolitical, which we are, but why can't we reach out, President Mehta, to our Rotary districts, our Rotary countries, and put pressure on our politicians to speak out against Mr. Putin and against this barbarism. It's just, to me, we need to do something. And I was disappointed to not see a statement in the April Rotary magazine, but can you share with us, and maybe it's sensitive, what we are going to come out to the world? And can we get our 1.2 million Rotarians to really be more voiceful about this problem.
Yes, as I said, their statement is being worked on as we speak. The board is meeting as we speak. In fact, I had to jump out of the board meeting to participate in this call. I don't want to prejudge what the statement's going to say, but there will be a statement coming out. On the club and district level, I personally feel do what you need to do what you want to do, and it's, go for it. Continue to put pressure on our politicians to do whatever you think they need to be doing to end this war, to support Ukraine, to support the refugees, by all means. I mean, because this conflict for me is not gray. It's pretty clear cut here, right? This isn't like, two countries that one country was doing. This is like unprovoked, completely, unnecessary, and completely beyond the pale in terms of the atrocities that are happening. So I think from a moral perspective, if we don't do something proactively now, then when would we? What more do we need to see? Nuclear weapon dropped, chemical weapons being used. At what point? Well, so I think Tony, by all means, at the local club level, throughout the world, feel free, and I encourage you, and this is me personally speaking, to do that. Rotary, we're a slightly different position. We're going to come out with a statement. I think it will be a strong statement. It'll be a good statement, and of course, we're doing our part by raising and distributing all this money for the refugees.
Thank you. Nick from Wall Street.
Oh, thank you so much. So thank you so much for the invitation and another amazing meeting. And John, we started weeks ago, and I see Bill Tobin from Shelterbox as well on the call, who'd been the speaker for our club some weeks ago. My question is, let's say my professional background, besides my role with Rotary, I'm a professional speaker. So I'm located in Germany, not far away from Düsseldorf, where you're going to speak. And so one idea in the early beginning of the war was, why not reaching out to, let's say, our celebrity speakers, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Klitschko guys? Would this have an impact talking to you on this situation? Because I know I feel you, and I feel this this back and forth, because you presented so beautifully in the beginning. So there is this, let's say, personal John, and there is you taking or communicating the role as representative Rotary International. Does this help to bring in celebrity, let's say, speakers into the game?
Well, sure. I think, Schwarzenegger is an example. He's already put a very strong video out that was subtitled in Russian to the Russian people, because I think he's very popular in Russia on this war. Sean Penn, if you I saw him being interviewed on Fox News, Sean Hannity the other night. Talk about a contrast, but they had a very civilized conversation about Ukraine and what Sean Penn was seeing with this documentary that he's doing there. So yes, to the extent we as Rotarians engage celebrities, both to communicate to our fellow Rotarians, but also to encourage celebrities to speak out, I think that's a really good thing. So yes, I would
Great, because when I reached out to my board, they said no, because of course talking to people outside of the Rotary world. But for me, it was crystal clear, because our mission is just to be active, to use our brains, our professional networks. And so, yeah, thank you so much.
I would encourage that. Sure. I mean, if that's, obviously there may be clubs that say, no, we don't want to get involved in this. And every club has the freedom to sort of figure out what its level of engagement is. That's the beauty of Rotary.
Because that's the benefit of your personal network. So I do know these guys. So
right.
Great. Thank you so much.
Frank Bannister, Dublin.
Actually in New York, Gerard.
Well.
I'm hoping to get down there for the police event next month. It'd be lovely to see you again in person. John, can I go back and pick your brains on a historical rather than a Rotarian point? You said that after the breakup of the Soviet Union, that the Ukraine evolved into a pretty robust democracy. Russia flirted with this, and probably not for the first time in its history, if we go back to the beginning of the last century. Right. Why is it that Russia always seems to go back to strongman? Is this something in their national character, or is the Russians condemned to do this for eternity? Because it seems to me that as long as you've got strong men like Stalin or Putin or whoever in charge, Russia's going to be a problem for its neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question to answer in a diplomatic way. Yes, I think that's a question that I think for the Russian people to ask is, why have we tended historically to gravitate toward these strong authoritarian figures? What is it in our character? What is it in our history? What is it in our culture that seems to gravitate toward that? I mean, the Ukrainians, I can speak for the Ukrainians, they've had a slightly different history in that you had the Cossacks, you had that freedom of the steppe. There's a much greater tradition of individualism and, disrespect for authority that perhaps, again, I don't want to speak as a Russian cultural expert, but as from the Ukrainian perspective. And then you have Western Ukraine, which was, is completely different, coming from the Austro-Hungarian tradition, and Poland and Western Catholic. It's a completely different mindset. But you've asked the difficult question, and I think is one that the Russians need to answer. What kind of society do they want to have? What kind of future do they want to have? What's important to them? And in some ways, governments are a reflection of what societies have kind of wanted and asked for themselves. And because look, Ukraine and Russia came out of the exact same post-Soviet space. They're part of the same country, right? And shared a long history during the Russian imperial times. And look at the different directions that the two countries took, diametrically different. So there is something different in the character and in the DNA and the cultural approaches by both countries. And I think it's really for the Russians to determine what they want their future to look like. We can't do it for them.
Thank you. John German, unmute yourself, please. John German? There we go.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, in all those daily meetings with people in Ukraine and in the region working on this essentially 24/7, it came out at the very beginning that in Ukraine, Rotaract clubs had been holding dialogues or meetings with Rotaract clubs in Russia. I thought this is a spectacular initiative, and I asked, is this still continuing? Is there anything we can do? And the answer I got from the people who organized it was, no, it's dead, it's stopped. I couldn't agree more with your comment about it's up to the Russian people. Is it all right? Is it helpful from a Rotary point of view if we try to reestablish that and find out what they care about, what they want to see, what they want to do, what they want to set in motion for the future? I'm deeply concerned about the lack of understanding of the people who we should be having contact with. And in the first wave, I would think that having contact with other Rotarians would be a terrific start. What do you think, and how can we take this forward?
I think right now we have to look at this realistically. And, any dialogue is fraught with danger. On the Ukrainian side, extraordinary anger and with what's happening. It's natural. There's still countries being systematically destroyed and leveled. And so you're not going to see, I suspect, a lot of, desire on the part of the Ukrainians to engage in some kind of dialogue with Russia, just as a practical matter. There's a war going on, etc. From the Russian side, they're in a very difficult position because even if they wanted to establish the dialogue, they put themselves in pretty significant danger by having, conversations with, assuming the Ukrainians even wanted to have it at this point, having those conversations. So I think now the practical reality is when we're in the middle of this brutal war, I just don't see a practical, an emotional way that a dialogue can be established. Now, once the war ends and all this we get into the new normal after the war ends, hopefully it will, then at that point, I think is the moment to say, okay, how can we realistically, given the political realities in both countries, begin to establish that person-to-person dialogue? I just don't see anything happening now. Both from the Ukrainian and Russian sides, given the realities that both are living through right now.
Okay, we're running out of time, unfortunately. Alan Schlafer, you've had your hand up a while.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great discussion. I wanted to add one quick positive note, which all of you should be aware of. There's the wonderful series starring President Zelensky before he became president called Servant of the People on Netflix. It makes the current situation all the more poignant. But on a different note, we're trying to move toward more green energy, which creates its own vulnerabilities. What can we do to try to get our politicians to open up our resources, shale oil and gas, to not only try to cut the costs here in this country, but reduce cost and dependence by our European allies on that Russian monster, which is bringing in roughly $350 billion from oil revenues this year.
And here again, I'm speaking my personal capacity. I think you make a great point. I mean, at the end of the day, this does come down to energy. I think this hesitancy by some of the European countries to perhaps put as harsher sanctions as quickly as possible was the fact that they're so heavily dependent on Russian oil and gas. But I do think there's been a shift from what I can tell, a huge move on the part of both Europe and the States to figure out how does Europe certainly wean itself off of Russian oil and gas. And again, I'm not an expert in the energy field, but it certainly has been a huge factor, a big dynamic in this whole process. And again, from what I understand, there's pretty concerted efforts now. I think Lithuania has completely stopped all coal and oil and gas imports from Russia, and I think the rest of Europe is moving in that direction. Although it's going to take time, because particularly a country like Germany, extraordinarily, in fact, what's quite surprising to me is that they're actually more dependent after Crimea on Russian oil and gas than they were prior to Crimea. But it does seem to be significant movement in that direction to try to remedy that situation.
Alan, if I could address something, because we have run out of time. You mentioned something in the chat box about 501c3, and certainly Rotary Club of New York, we have a huge foundation, which is a 501c3. Frank Bannister mentioned something earlier. On May the 12th, the Rotary Club of New York is hosting the new police commissioner of the Police Department, City of New York, at a great luncheon at the Union League Club. All will be invited. Anyone who's going to be in New York, you're welcome to come. We've also entered into an agreement. Rotary Club of New York has entered into an agreement with the top brass, with the mayor and with the police commissioner, where we're planning to sponsor community-based meetings between the leaders of the New York City Police Department and community leaders and members of the community, to give them a chance to talk to each other, to speak to each other. This is something we feel Rotarians are in a great position to do. On Monday, we had an incredible meeting with the Chancellor of the Board of Education, City of New York. We brought together with him, we have the president of UNICEF USA and the leadership of his team to meet with we met with the Chancellor's group in the headquarters for the Department of Education, City of New York, to have UNICEF present its findings on how to deal with the issues children have as a result of COVID. And these are very real issues that children are facing all over the world. And I think these are ways that as Rotarians, we can get involved, not just donating money. We're not taking a political position. We're not aligned with any party. We're apolitical. That does not mean that we cannot get involved with these bread and butter issues and take leadership on it. And John, I know you have to go. You have another meeting in a minute or two. I want to thank you so much. I apologize to those of you who still have your hands up. We haven't been able to get to you. This has been a great treat for us, John. We're very proud to have you as our director. Thank you so much.
No, and thanks so much for having me. And just if I can make a plug, my wife is this year's president of the Chicago Club, downtown Chicago, club number 1. And she's her club, and she's very active in the Ukraine thing as well. And also in some of the issues that you just outlined, Jared, the more local type issues. So if there may be some synergies in terms of both clubs getting together and seeing if there's some there to do some stuff together. But thank you for having me. You got a great club, and thanks for all that you're doing. And please know that we here at the Secretariat in Evanston are here to support you. And I look forward to continuing to work with your club and with all of you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. You make us proud. Andreas, would you tell everyone how they can get a copy of this recording, please?
Yes, actually, whoever registered, I will send it to you. I have your emails, and everyone else can just send me an email at executive director@nyrotary.org. So that will be it.
Take care.
Okay, thank you again, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with us. Stay safe.
Thank you so much.